Hello, thank you for joining us for tonight's event. My name is Rachel and I'm a marketing coordinator here at Powell's Books. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. In the coming weeks, we're looking forward to welcoming Janara Narenberg with Maya Dusenberry on July 13th, Diane Zinna with Natalie Jenner on July 21st, and Shayla Lawson and Emma DeBerry on July 26th, among others. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And if you haven't already done so, you can sign up for our weekly events email at powells.com. Tonight, we're honored to welcome Julia Alvarez and Samantha Mabry. Julia Alvarez left the Dominican Republic for the US in 1960 at the age of 10. She's the author of novels, nonfiction, poetry, and books for children and young adults. A recipient of a 2013 National Medal of Arts, Alvarez is one of the founders of Border of Lights, a movement to promote peace and collaboration between Haiti and Dominican Republic. Afterlife is Alvarez's first adult novel in almost 15 years. Set in this political moment of tribalism and distrust, it asks, what do we owe those in crisis in our families, including, maybe especially, members of our human family? How do we live in a broken world without losing faith in one another or ourselves? And how do we stay true to those glorious souls we have lost? Tonight, Alvarez is joined in the conversation by Samantha Mabry, author of Tigers Not Daughters and The Fierce and Subtle Poison. She teaches writing and Latino literature at a community college in Dallas, where she lives with her husband, a historian, her son, and a cat named Mouse. This evening's event will also include a Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. If someone has typed a question that you'd also like to know the answer to, please consider upvoting that particular question. Most importantly, please consider supporting Julia Alvarez, Samantha Mabry, and Powell's by purchasing a copy of their books. A link to buy their books was included in your registration email and will also be shared in the chat a few times this evening. Without any further ado, please welcome Julia Alvarez and Samantha Mabry.
Thank you.
Yay.
And thank you, Samantha, for doing this again. We were just discussing, we were at a virtual event 2 months ago in Wichita.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I love books. And but you're based in Dallas and I'm here in Vermont. So and hello to everybody who's joined us. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Yeah, thank you. I think that Rachel had questions, right? Or did she want us to get started on our own?
I think we can get started, and then she said there was a few questions that had come in beforehand.
Okay.
That we can put in later.
Yeah. So Julia and I are here. We share a publisher. We're both with the lovely Algonquin Books. And so in advance of the last event we did in Wichita, they sent me a copy and I read it, and I was sort of facilitating a discussion between myself and Julia and Luis Urrea, who's the author of so many wonderful books, including The Devil's Highway and The Hummingbird's Daughter. But I just have, and I took some more notes on Afterlife, because I'm also a teacher, an English teacher, and so when I read anything, I take notes on it. But I was thinking about how there's a lot in the book about women's obligation or role in helping other women, whether it's strangers or immediate families, because both happen in Afterlife. And so I guess I was wanting you to talk about your thoughts on the kinship of women, or how sort of women helping women in all different kind of contexts.
Wow. Yes, and of course you've written about it in Tigers Not Daughters. It's sisters, and I think that I think part of it is female. I think it's also Latino, because I think that the way that I was raised, it was always, I was part of a we. I was part of an extended familia. It wasn't even nuclear, it was an extended familia. So you always moved as a little bead in the necklace of the generations. You weren't a single self. And it particularly fell to the women in the familia to keep everything going, to gather people, to take care of people. It was a very patriarchal, macho world, seemingly, but I knew from the beginning that the power lay in the females in the family. They were really the matriarchs, the storytellers, the gatherers and cooks and whatever. So I think that I grew up with that bond, and it's always been. I come from a family of all girls, so female connection, with not to airbrush it because it can be very complicated and at times very emotional and angry and all those things, but it's a bond that I really, it's part of my fiber almost. As with Antonia, she says about herself and her sisters that sometimes she feels like they're only a whole person when the four of them are together.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I share that with my character in the novel, the bond of women and the bond of caretaking the group that comes very much from my roots.
Mm. I was thinking about, so I wrote about sisters and tigers, not daughters, as you know, and what I said before when we talked on the other day was that I don't have sisters. So that's all, I don't know what it's like to have sisters.
You do. You convinced me. I thought you got it.
But I am like you retired from being a teacher, right? Is that right? And so I teach college, and I have this, I try to have a relationship with the young women that you try to be a role model, or you try to sort of lift them up, And I recently had this experience with a student. It was at the end of the fall semester, and I accused her of cheating. Like, she turned in a draft of a paper in an English class that was clearly not right. It was not hers, And so I was like, this is not right. And she got really upset, and she called me a fucking bitch in class. And I was thinking, I think I deserved this. Like, later I was thinking, I probably deserve this. Like, I let this young woman down. I could have done better in lifting up. Why did I have to do that? How did I get her to that point? And I was just kind of thinking about that, because I think that Antonia does feel like she will not get it right. Like, when she's helping, that like, is she going to do this right? Is she going to mess it up? Is she going to, what the result is going to be, because like, we do get it wrong.
Right. Well, I think part of what Antonia comes to, and what I often had to tell myself teaching, and what I think about, in life, is asking yourself the questions that you ask yourself after an experience is really the way to be right, in a sense. It's the right thing, because we're going to get it wrong. We're going to get it wrong. We're going to say something that's going to wound, and someone will carry it. We're also going to say something that we didn't think was that important, and that student will come back, 10, in my case, that I've been teaching over 50 years, they'll come back and they'll tell you, that one thing, and you think, oh my God, I don't remember that, but something you said. So you're going to get it wrong, but I think what you did is just asking yourself the questions and being mindful. That's the best we can do. The best we can do. And when you're teaching, you have this enormous power, in a sense. You're conducting a class, and Antonia is very aware of aware of it. And now that she's retired, she misses it. She realizes that it was a critical and important relationship. This always having this little community to bring things to. You know, you were talking about how you take notes and everything because you're thinking how to teach it. I'm still I find passages, I cut things out of journals. I save poems thinking this will go so well with this. And then I think, when are you going to do that?
Yeah.
Because there's that, and that is something that I miss. But as you know, as a writer, it's so hard to make your living by the pen. And so many of us have spent our careers also as teachers in classrooms, being close to the literature we love, teaching the craft we love. So it's an important part of our lives, not just the writing, but that mentoring that happens.
I think that another question I have that kind of goes along with that is that Antonia is a retired professor, and in her life pops up lines of poetry or phrases and things she's taught just as if it's a thought from her own head, and I think that as writers, and certainly everyone who is listening as readers, you have these lines that just become part of the fabric of who you are, right? And I was, before everybody logged on, I was talking about how I have a 2-year-old and I've just felt like 1,000 years old every day since the quarantine, being home with him. And the line in Miles to Go Before I Sleep, like the Dylan Thomas line, that's like always on a loop in my head, I understand this weariness. And I just love how Antonia just carries around the lines that she loves with her, and they sort of offer strength and comfort to her.
It's almost also like string in the labyrinth. You feel so lost sometimes, or you're in a maze, or you're confused, or the feeling is overwhelming. And then a line comes up, and it's almost like something's been thrown at you that's like a lifesaver. It's something, it at least makes meaning of it. You feel like it understands, and you feel accompanied. So I often, I recently found out there is a name for what I often do in my journal. It's not always entries of my own text. It's full of quotes and favorite passages that I love so much that I want to write them out. I want to touch them. I want to form them. And they're called commonplace books, which are journals filled with all your favorite quotes. So, yeah, I find myself even doing that as a kind of, I don't know, especially this time of quarantine, I find that certain lines and passages just really help light a little votary candle for the day. Candle. It just is important.
I'm going to pull a couple of questions from the Q&A, because there's a couple that kind of hit on the same question, which is about grief. And so one of them says that it's similar to another. Is the death of a significant character occurs in many of your books. How do you draw knowledge on grief to portray it through your characters so well? So how are you able to draw grief so clearly?
Well, I mentioned that extended familia, and it's great growing up. I grew up, I mentioned this before, so Samantha's heard some of these stories. But, my father was the youngest of 25 kids. The first wife had 10, and then she died, amazingly, not in childbirth. And the second one had 15. My father was the youngest. So I grew up really in a clan I had so many tias and older cousins, primos, primas, madrina, padrino, abuelo, abuela. You know, I had so many, and it was great growing up because you have many alternate mothers. If you have not the best relationship with your mother, you have a lot of other mothers. Storytellers, someone's always willing to tell you a story. And it's great, very loving and inclusive, not without its craziness and everything else. But what happens is that when you start losing them, when you lose, you don't just lose one tia, one tío, a little nuclear family, you lose dozens of people. And it's like a whole phalanx of a generation is suddenly gone. So at a certain point in my life, once I hit 50, it just started to happen. There are just so many deaths, so many losses, and it just started to feel like the world was emptying. So I was very acquainted past my 50s in grief. I lost both my parents. I lost them first to Alzheimer's for 10 years. We took care of them. And that's a slow grieving of losing them. And then, you know, before I wrote Afterlife, I felt like even before the pandemic that we were living in a time, in what I call elegiac time, a time of grieving, where we were just seeing the ending of so many things, whole species going extinct, climate change, coastal populations suddenly threatened by going underwater. We were seeing the draconian immigration laws, violence in the schools, gun violence, violence against communities of colors. I felt like communities of color. I felt like we were surrounded by loss, loss, loss. And that was part of the thing that I wanted to put my character, Antonia. One of the things I'm asking with the novel is, how do we live with loss, with everything falling apart, and not lose faith in each other or ourselves? How do we keep hope alive? And I didn't have any answers, but I think novels don't provide answers. They give you a way to travel the questions. So definitely grief has been a major part of my life, both personally and I think globally, nationally. It's been a part of all our lives. And now with the pandemic, you know, when you watch some of those figures and the reports of deaths and globally and nationally, it's astonishing, yes.
I know that a friend of mine sent me a article from, I think it was the Harvard Business Review, and it was, the title of it was, "That emotion you're feeling right now is grief." And it was just like, this is what it feels like to grieve a life that you had, a world that you knew, you know, patterns that you trusted in. And, you know, here's how the stages of grief could play out. And I realized that like my whole life right now is bargaining. I'm like, if we wear the mask for 2 weeks, then this will happen. And then we can go to Starbucks, and then we can, you know, like these, I'm trying to sort of make these logical, illogical leaps.
Wow. It is, I think it's definitely grieving. I was telling a friend, you know, now we see people socially distanced and, you know, very sure, because, you know, you're outside and after a while you're not breaking bread together. So it's briefer visits. But I was telling a friend that even after I've seen people, and I'm so glad to lay eyes on them, to have them physically there, I always feel a little depressed because the whole visit is imbued with nostalgia. And now I realize by what you said, grief also in a sense, because it's the sense that a way of life is over. You know, something is not going to be the same. And I'm always aware of the last time I saw them and the things that we could do that we could no longer do easily. So I think there is that element of grief in how we're living right now. And definitely in, you know, the way my character Antonia has to navigate a world where there's a lot of sudden loss in her life.
Another question that someone has that kind of goes along with this, also somebody corrected me, thank you, that the miles to go before I sleep is Robert Frost and not Dylan Thomas. I wonder what I am thinking when I think about Dylan, why that connection was. But somebody says that they heard you speak in 2008
Wow.
at Goddard College, and said that you said the time of the lone wolf is over. And you expanded to say that we need to not isolate ourselves and to come together. And what does that mean for a writer who often works in solitude? And I know that question is directed at you, but it makes me think again of students, or, you know, these are the people that I interact with. And I dedicated Tigers Not Daughters to my students just because, like, I learned so much from them. And so in a way, I write by myself clearly, but you live with you know, the people you live with. But that it is a question for you based on your quote. How can you sort of come together, but also in a when you work alone, essentially?
Right. Well, I think you're right. When you teach, you have this community that's very vibrant and very much in your head all the time. How the students' issue with writing a story, you're thinking about it, you read something, you think, oh, that might be helpful to the, you know, you're constantly having them present. And there is that community that you feel that's very powerful. But I also think, I do two things. One thing that comes to mind is that sometimes I feel the closest to people when I'm writing. That somehow you touch bottom in a way that it doesn't always happen with people, where other surface things come in the way, or you know, your caution or hesitation. With writing, I feel like I'm really connected, both to my characters, and when I put out a book, to my readers, in a way that almost is not about me or my little self or ego. It goes deeper. I enter a bigger stream, so that I'm not alone at all. And reading, I always feel, has been about being together apart, because that's what happens when you read. You become the others. So I do think there's something that connects you to maybe a deeper root of community when you write and when you read. So there is that. But I also think there are times, as are the times we're living in, and I'm not just talking about the pandemic, but politically, when I think that you have to also put your art where your activism is, and try to find a balance of how to contribute immediately to work that needs to be done. And it's beautiful when you can use your work to do that as well. But I think I just have founded this project with a fellow artist, and it's going live on July 25th, and it's called the Scheherazade Project, based on Scheherazade of the Arabian Nights, which has always been my muse and my mentor. She's the woman who told stories to keep herself alive during the time of the cruel Sultan. And what we were going to do, this was pre-pandemic, it was all planned, is that for 101 nights before election night, one artist, female artist, would go in front of the White House and perform her art, whether it was tell a story, read a poem, dance a dance, play a piece of music, sketch a little something, then close up her thing and leave. No polemics, just performing her art as a way of protest and underscoring that we are living in the time of a very misguided sultan who has run away with a kingdom, or is trying to. And then the pandemic came, but now we're going to be going online starting July 25th till the eve of election night. Every night, an artist, we have 101, more than 101 signed up. It's called the Scheherazade Project, and it's an effort to connect activism with artists. So we have dancers, painters, singers, musicians, writers. Every night one will be featured. And it's, you know, I was thinking, what can I do? Because I'm under quarantine with a husband who has a lung disease, so we have to be very careful. So I'm not out marching, and I'm not out doing, but this is a way that you can do the activism and place your art where that activism is.
And somebody in the chat, just so you know, Julia, has linked that website for the Scheherazade Project, so they can find that. Right, because I there's also that line, one of the lines that is, I was mentioning sort of bits of poetry and that are sprinkled throughout Afterlife. At the there's the line from the Rilke poem, "You must change your life," the line at the end. And this is another one that I kind of think about a lot, especially when I'm not changing my life, right? Or you're like, why am I not doing this line, this really urgent line that, you know, is really so wonderful. But I think that a lot happens in the book, and then just in the world right now, is that there's so much to suggest that others change your life for you. You know, like your life is not necessarily changed because of you taking a step in a certain direction, although that can happen. People and events are sort of whipping you around and causing you to change. You know, not even in you must change your life doesn't even have, like, it doesn't mean do better. It could be do better. It could be do something. I mean, there's so much of that is at the hands of others, or at the hands of unexpected things.
Well, you know, I think that it's certainly true of Antonia. You know, she is trying for very careful self-management. Well, spoiler alert, because she loses her husband in the first page.
Yeah.
Novel. And, you know, all these, she's just finished a long career, so she's lost her students, she's lost her job, her way of finding meaning. She doesn't feel any desire to create or write or anything. So everything seems to have fallen apart. And she's trying very hard to control and keep a grip on it, and things keep happening. And boy, don't we know that from what's been happening in the last 6 months. It's just been crazy. But I think that I think one of the things we talked about at the beginning, Samantha, that you were saying that afterwards you asked yourself those questions, you know, that is a way to change your life, just to reflect upon it and consider and even play with what could have been, is a way of creatively engaging with the possibility of reconstructing it and doing it differently. And I think many days I tell myself I can't do anything about what's going on in terms of the pandemic and what's, you know, what's at all our doorsteps, but I can try to have an attitude that I can try to control, that accepts it. And and sometimes I tell myself, you know, I just feel terrible. I feel terrible. And I think I've got to keep my spirits up, both for Bill, for the people in my life, because you don't just, by the time you get to be any age, you don't just belong to yourself, but you belong to all the people who have invested in you and love you. So that part of you that belongs to them is their real estate. And you got to help take care of it, if not yourself. So I think it's the attitude a lot that makes the difference, because we're not in control.
We are almost halfway done with this conversation, which is amazing because it seems like we just got started. So I'm just going to remind everyone that I'm in charge of the Q&A and the chat, and I have both open. So there are many people here, and we're so grateful for all of you. So I'm going to do my best to go through these questions as they come in the chat and in the Q&A. And yes, if there is a question in the Q&A that you would like to, you would also like to hear the answer to, you can click the little thumbs up and that'll push it to the top. So one that has been up at the top for a while is someone is asking you to give us an idea of what's behind the dragon image that is utilized throughout the book, I'm assuming, Afterlife.
Right. Well, I don't know if any of you have seen old medieval maps where they believe that what they knew of the known world, they would draw the map and then they would draw these awful dragons at the edges. And it's where the world dropped off. The known world dropped off. So to me, it's the guardians of the unknown, the things that they can come in and destroy and that you're unsure of, that you're afraid of. So it's very much a kind of medieval iconography out there. But for Antonia, it's all the ways in which her life can cave in and fall apart, all the craziness that can come in, all her fears, all her terror of not being in control. So the dragon is all those things that, that terrify us. And for different people, it's not a dragon, it has different faces, but it's what we fear, what can destroy us, what can make us break apart. And of course, what Antonia discovers is that sometimes there's no defense and you have to break apart in order to come together as a larger version of yourselves. But at the moment that the breakage happens, there's no guarantees you're gonna put it back together. And of course, Antonia has a sister that is an immediate example of someone that falls apart in a scary way.
Yes, I think that's really interesting because, as I mentioned at the top, there's the two women that Antonia is trying to help in different ways, right? And those two situations unfold very, very differently. So it's just, again, it is scary, right? Because you don't know what you want to help because you want the outcome to work out.
Right. And sometimes the best thing that you can do is to let people, well, I think the best thing you can do is to let people figure it out themselves, but accompany them. I think that's very, 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 very hard. As a parent, you want them to stop suffering. You want to fix it. And the hardest thing is to keep your mouth shut when they're older and let them figure it out, but let them know that you're accompanying them with a friend. Same thing, just to accompany them can be the best thing that you do.
The way that I have heard that said is to hold the space. Like you hold the space for them to do what they need to do.
And part of why we go to books is that reading can often help us in a really broken, difficult moment to feel accompanied, to feel like you read something and someone really gets where you're at and you feel less alone. It hasn't solved anything, but you feel accompanied. And that's for me, that's a really important reason why I read.
Yeah, and I think that I write young adult novels, and I think that a lot of them that I was reading before I started writing were almost like solution based, like girl character is angry, and then she finds a group of friends and it's all better.
Yeah.
She finds her strength, and that is a positive narrative, but I wanted to read girl is angry, stays angry. Anger is justified, and she is not seen as, broken because she has strong feelings. And so those were the kinds of stories that I wanted to sort of explore as far as what a young woman could go through.
And I've always liked that about your work, Samantha, that I feel like it's not airbrushed. It's not an airbrushed world to make it all better. Because it's complicated being young, and you're angry, and you're trying to figure things out. And that just makes you feel lonelier and crazier if you're reading about these perfect little worlds coming together, because that's not your experience. But I did want to ask you, because I've also written for young adults and kids, what do you think of this way that we're corralled into gated communities of age and what we write? Because I read, Tigers Not Daughters. I'm not at all thinking this is YA. It's just young characters.
Right.
And I also read about old characters. So what do you think about these distinctions?
Some people, I clearly think they're meaningless, the distinctions, but I get a lot of questions from librarians, and they're not necessarily asking for themselves, but they're asking because the parents ask them about content. Is there sex in it? Is it, we can't have that, or we can have like fade out kissing. So there's just like these kind of strange, I do remember once a copywriter told me that I was using curse words too much. And it was like a note that was like to the editor, is this okay? First curse word on page 7. Like, is that okay? I was like, I cursed more when I was 16 than I do now. Like that's how young people talk, like my friends, we're just trying to come up with the most creative ways to say things. But so there's sort of a sense of some parents, I think, are just gatekeepers in a way of what they feel is appropriate for young people. And there's just that word, right? Like, why is this, are these young people look up to you, or these young people? And I'm just like, I don't, if a young person is offended by something in one of my books, then my books aren't for that person. Like I'm not going to write for the broadest audience possible. I'm going to write what I feel is a true story about young people, and it may not always be for all young people. I mean, because when I was a young person, I was reading like Anne Rice. Like that's what we were all reading, like real graphic stuff, and that's what people were reading when we were 16, 17, any kind of Anne Rice novels that we could get our hands on.
Well, I think I was just thinking about, the same when you're typed as a Latina writer, I don't think that a label, I think a label, when it feels like a way of describing, can be useful, can honor, in fact, your heritage, your roots, your age group, your demographic, whatever. But I think we can all sense when a label becomes a way to put someone in what Antonia in the novel calls into an othering chute, that you just kind of, you feel like it's closing down the world on you. putting you in a little sort of ghetto over there, you know, a minority, another term that drives me batty, but you can feel that when a label is a useful description, and when it's being used to separate and reduce a work or a group of people or a culture or an ethnicity or race. So it's tricky.
Yeah. I mean, we get questions like, would an 8th grade boy read your book? And I'm like, I don't know. Yes. How is that even a question? I don't know how to answer that question.
There's one type of 8th grade book, 8th grade reader. You know, my 8-year-old grandson, his favorite book, and I'm sure it's because his mother, you know, had it on books on tape and they listened to it, is the Odyssey. He knows all the heroes. They're all superheroes. He, you know, he's plays with different Greek armies. He'll correct you if you get the mythology wrong. And who would think an 8th grade boy would be so much into the Odyssey? So there isn't a type of reader. But yes, I have been told that too. When I wrote my Tia Lola books, the copy editor didn't like the fact that I called Tia Lola. She had to describe, the mother had to describe what Tia Lola was a santera. You know, she is mounted by spirits and so forth, but there wasn't a word to describe it. So the mom says, well, it's kind of like a witch. And the copy editor says, if we keep that in, we'll lose the South. We'll lose the Bible Belt. Sorry, not the South. We'll lose the Bible Belt. They won't buy that about a character in there who's a witch. And I thought, gosh, you know. So it's also about marketing. And yeah.
I like with my previous book, All the Wind in the World, it's about people harvesting maguey, the cactus, like the big agave cactus. And someone made something about like, we don't know what this is. Like we need, it doesn't, like there wasn't enough context or something to figure out what a word meant, you know. But I don't know.
Why not have something that readers have to reach for? You know, we talked before about, I'm rereading a lot of Toni Morrison's books because I read them, you know, 25, 30 years ago. And I wanted to return to some of them. And also a wonderful documentary on PBS recently aired called Pieces of Me, which is about her whole career. And she said one of the novel things that she did was that she said she wasn't writing for the white gaze. She wasn't writing her novels and explaining things so that the white people would understand it. She was writing from within a culture about people and to people that she didn't have to explain certain things. And so I think a lot of, I think as a Latina writer who didn't publish her first novel till she was 41 because the market, I mean, multiculturalism didn't exist. It was, you know, people thought what people like me were writing was sociology, a sociological study that was about a Latino family. And I think part of the thing when you started writing and publishing is many times you felt like you had to explain to a mainstream writer Latino things because they wouldn't get it. And more, I just assume that as they read, they will become Latinized. They will enter that world. And even if they don't know what something means, they'll figure it out the way a little kid does. By just being immersed in a world of home, you learn so many things that aren't explained to you. The same thing when you read. So I think I have, as I've grown and matured as a writer, allowed myself to just go for it. You know, if a word comes up Spanish, I don't have to immediately translate it. A lot of my readers will get it from the context and feel even smarter by having done it, you know?
Yeah. Let me see. The question, I was saving this for the last, because it's usually the last question in Q&A, but it's been voted up the top. It has a lot, is about favorite books, because I know that you were talking about Toni Morrison, and you were talking about Toni Morrison even before we started this conversation. But this is, would each of you name a book you've read recently that you can't stop thinking about and that you would recommend to us? Let me also bring up the fact that when we talked about this last time, we were talking about Annie Dillard, and
Rift of Annie Dillard.
on and on, on and on. And so before we're not even going to start that, but Powell's is going to link Teaching a Stone to Talk, the essay collection by Annie Dillard, because that's what we talked about last time. But you can talk more about Toni Morrison and your project of rereading her.
Well, you know, I recently decided that there were certain books that I read as a younger woman, and I wanted, in part, there's a richness to rereading, especially if some time has passed, and especially if it's the same book, that the same copy of the book that you had before, because then you can read your little comments and go, whoa, I didn't get that. But it just, in a way, it's like seeing where you've measured yourself on a wall and seeing how you've, you know, gone up an inch, or in my case, shrunk. It's really, it's wonderful. It's a very rich experience. So Beloved just blew me away. And I started reading Toni Morrison's essays. Mouthful of Blood is a collection of her essays throughout her life, which I have been reading. A wonderful, wonderful book. One of the books that I can't stop thinking about, because it's made me wonder how to different ways of putting a narrative together, is A Paragon by Colin McCann. It's an yeah, it's a wonderful book, and I can't say enough wonderful things about it. I went on a Jenny Erpenbeck craze. I read everything she wrote, and I'm just waiting for her to come up with the next book. She's a German writer, but she has a wonderful translator. And my favorite of the novels is Go, Went, Gone. It's a beautiful novel about the politicization of an older character. Because that's the other thing. I got very interested in novels as I was writing Afterlife, novels with older protagonists. Because as I said, you know, I read also for books that are missing from the shelf. You mentioned this with YA, wanting books with complicated young characters. And I wrote García Girls and other novels about Latino characters because they were missing when I was growing up from the shelf. And so now I'm really interested in older protagonists and how they fare in the world. So one of my favorite books, it's so unassuming and simple but powerful, is Our Souls at Night by Kent Haruf. It's a very short, beautiful novel, and there isn't one person I've recommended it to that hasn't fallen in love with it. And that's a record. So I really, one that I really love and go back to. What about you?
I am currently reading the third book of the Wolf Hall trilogy, Hilary Mantel's books about Thomas Cromwell.
Wow.
It is, like, a friend of mine was like, can you recommend a book to me? And I was like, I don't think that I can even recommend it. I was like, well, I'm reading this book about Thomas Cromwell, who served in the court of Henry VIII. It's the third of the trilogy. It's called Wolf. And she was like, I'm not interested in this at all. But I love these books. It's like 750 pages. It's a week overdue at the library. I was reading it in the car today, like while I was waiting for my cat to come back from the vet. Like, I'm truly obsessed with it. And it's just this character that she's drawn, and this complicated world. And usually it's hard for me to focus, but I just love these books so much. And it's called The Mirror and the Light. And so the first one's called Wolf Hall, and the second is called Bring Up the Bodies. And then the third is called The Mirror and the Light. And then I am always lately recommending a novel called The Revisioners by an author named Margaret Wilkerton Sexton. I feel like she is not talked about a lot. She is a contemporary writer who writes about New Orleans, and I'm forgetting what her first book was called, but they both do these jumps in time, sort of multi-generational African-American families in New Orleans. And so, you'll have like the grandmother's line, her story, and interspersed with the granddaughter's line, and they're so wonderful. She's so wonderful, and I don't hear her name mentioned as much as other writers, and so I'm always thinking about The Revisioners. I mean, she's so excellent. It's a short book.
Well, part of the thing that you mentioned, it's a very interesting thing. That someone will describe a book and you think, not my type. I'm not going to get into that. And you start reading, and good writing, that's what it does. It entices you, it engages you, it draws you in. And suddenly, this is the most interesting subject. And you wouldn't, from the outside, have been able to say that. So I think it's the good writing that makes a subject come alive for a reader.
Mm-hmm. The chat, they maybe Rachel can help with this, or whoever's on the Powell's end. The Colum McCann, it's called a paragon, but it's like a spelling that is, it's not a paragon, it's one word. And so they should link to that, because people, the spelling is
one. If I turn around, I'll start naming off. I'll remember a lot of books to recommend, and I won't spend time with you all instead. But there's so many wonderful books, so little time to get them all read.
I will ask one last question, which is how have you what's your writing schedule compared to pre-quarantine? And then this is the second part of this question is interesting, is do you find the constant hum of uncertainty we find ourselves in impacting your writing?
I think that, of course it is. I try to keep to my rituals, because I believe that rituals, and it's very tricky, when does a ritual become rigid? So you have to, again, be asking yourself those questions that you asked in the classroom, did I do it right? What could I have done differently? So you're constantly asking yourself, but I find rituals and, following them really important now as a way to enter other rhythms than the craziness of the news, and the panic, and the fear, than all the things that can happen. The rituals are ways of affirming the deeper root of continuing. That said, I think, and I've said this before, that we're living in a deeply mythic moment right now, and things are coming apart, and many of them, as they rightly should. It was their time, a long time ago, with racism, climate change. Things are coming apart, and we shouldn't rush to put it back together the way that we feel safe and it fits, because the danger there is that we'll put it back together and continue with the same problems. So I tell myself to follow what I tell other people, that when we're talking about it, is don't let this mythic moment be lost on you. There's a certain level of attention that we have to be paying. And if we're not feeling distracted, if we're not feeling sometimes overwhelmed, we're not living this moment. And that it's important, because I think, especially, I guess, the way I've always written is I've written very much my life and my work are connected and very integrated. And if I'm not paying attention to the things around me and not bringing them in, then I think that if you sink below a certain level of awareness as a writer, you're no longer useful to your readers. I think you have to stay open, but that means that it's very distracting, and you're not always going to get something done. And maybe that's something to put out of our minds right now, that achievement grid that has gotten us into gridlock, and just move through this time and find the rituals that renew and connect you to the things that are important in your work and in your life. And they can be very simple. And it can be an entry in a journal instead of a complete polished chapter to a novel, that you want to write because this is the perfect time. You're in lockdown. Forget that.
I think that I do good writing when I am unsettled. And I think that you can bring a sense of that into the pages, and into your characters. Not that they're going to be unsettled in the same way that we're all unsettled right now. But they can simmer and have the sort of internal simmering that makes them, that makes them tick, that makes them interesting, and that sort of drives them.
Well, certainly,
it's the way that you can translate
the
discomfort into something that you're working on.
And also, I think that the part of the thing that's happening is that times like this help the really critical, important things come to the surface, and that can happen with your characters too. That there's somehow that sense of urgency, and that sense of urgency can make a character more, I don't know, give it more heart in a way as you're writing.
Yeah. It's 7:59. Does someone from Powell's need to come back?
Wonderful.
Before everything just turns off, we just want to say thank you to everybody, and thanks for your questions and everything.
Thank you, Samantha, for doing this again.
Thank you.
Wichita, Portland, what's next? I hope that we'll get to be in Powell, the actual space again. It's been wonderful every time I go to that cathedral of books, and a good time to say support your independent bookstores, because they are a vital institution, and they've been taking care of us authors and of us who are readers for so many years, curating what we read, and we need to support them in this tough time for independence, for bookstores. So go for Powell, order some of those books we mentioned.
Well, thank you, Julia and Samantha, so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. It was a pleasure to host the both of you, and welcome all of you. Yes, as Julia said, please consider purchasing a copy of Afterlife and Samantha Mabry's book, Tigers Not Daughters, at powells.com. And while you're there, please be sure to check out our lineup of other upcoming virtual events. And we look forward to seeing you at one of our events again soon. Take care.
Gracias.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
It's gotten to be night here, so bye.
Bye.
Bye.